This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. The date is April 25th, 1972. We are in eastern Oklahoma in Hanson. Is that the town, Hanson town area? Visiting with Mr. and Mrs. Ben Tuff Garvin, Garvin. Mr. Garvin is you're what part Cherokee are you, Mr. Garvin? 13/32, about 1/3, a little over a third, would be a little over a third Cherokee. And Miss Garvin's parents came over in a covered wagon in 1893 from Georgia, and we'll talk first with Mrs. Garvin. And Ms. Garvin, I'm just going to ask you to hold this mic about as far from you as where I am now. I mean, as where I have it now, and tell us to begin with. Where you were born and who your parents were. We'll talk about you first before we talk about them.
I was born here in Hanson in 1899, November 1899, and my parents were Mr. and Mrs. A.J. Good. My parents didn't come to Oklahoma together. My mother and her father and the family all came together in the covered wagon, in the wagon caravan, I'll say, and there were 6 wagons, and they traveled 20 miles a day, and it took them 2 months to make the trip.
I understood that they came about 1893, is that
Right.
correct?
Right.
What caused them to come here?
They had relatives that had come before them, and they had wrote to them and told them about the country and how they could good farmland they had here, and that's what they were, farmers, and they wanted to come here to farm.
Now, at this time, all the land was owned jointly by all of the Cherokees. How did they get a right to farm here?
Well, these folks that had already come had places rented for them to farm when they come, so they knew just where they were going. And people met them in Fort Smith, and they crossed the river on the ferry with their wagons and their teams, and came to these folks that were already here, Mr. Walford and Mr. White. They were relatives of my mother's folks, and so they went to their home, and they lived in a little log cabin. She said she remembered seeing the little log cabin when they drove up, and said that's what they all had to live in when they first came to Oklahoma.
Where was this log cabin?
Well, I don't know exactly where it was. Yes, not far from here. I think it's about 2.5 miles back over this way. I don't think it's still standing, but
did they move into an area that had never been plowed before?
well, I think they had to do some cultivating, clearing and everything, and fix some of the land had been cleared, but they had to do most of the clearing, I think, and get the land ready. I believe that's right.
What were they planting?
Well, I think corn and cotton was their main crops.
Did they have, now, of course, what happened with them when the Dawes Commission began to allot these lands? What happened to their land? Do you know? They were on Indian lands.
Well, they were just renting, and I don't know. I guess they just kept renting, moving from place to place, and finally, in later years, they were able to buy them a home, But most of them were just renting from that time. And my grandfather didn't stay too long. He went back to Georgia. But my mother was 17 years old at the time, and she stayed here. And she met my father here. He had come from Georgia too, but they didn't know. They hadn't met before they came here. They didn't know each other.
Where were they married?
Well, I don't know. I don't know exactly.
You told a story before we went on tape, which I thought was interesting, and that was about a relative who made the Cherokee Strip run in the Enid area and then swapped the land and what they swapped it for. Why don't you tell about that?
Well, my father went to, I don't know whether he made the run or how it happened. I don't remember about that. I just remember that hearing my mother say that he made the, I don't know, he got the land anyway and laid claim to it and stayed long enough to establish his claim, and then he got homesick and he sold it for a new wagon and team of mules and drove back home and didn't stay very long, just long enough to establish his right there.
A new wagon and team of mules was worth a lot in that.
Yeah, that's right, and he thought he had done real well.
I interviewed one lady one time whose father was offered a team of mules for the corner of who was offered a corner of Hudson and Main Street in Oklahoma City for a team of mules and turned it down.
Well,
because the mules were worth more.
Yeah. Well, anyway, they all wanted to have good teams, because they could raise a lot of cotton, and that was the main crop, and that's Mr. George Baldridge was the old Indian that had so much land here at the time, and he liked for the Georgians to come, and he liked to rent his land to them because they were all good workers, and they would just keep coming and coming.
Can you recall any of the stories that your mother told about this covered wagon trip to Oklahoma Indian Territory?
Well, there was 6 wagons, and she said they would travel 20 miles, and then they would stop and camp for the night, and the menfolk would fish and hunt, and they would build a big campfire then, and after they cooked and had their supper, the young folks would sing love songs and cowboy songs, and said they really had a good time. So I'm sure there were several young folks in the bunch, and then they would travel on. One night they stopped in the Mississippi swamps, and it began to come up a cloud, and so they got scared, and they all loaded up and moved on and traveled got as far out as they could out of there. And that was a pretty bad place to be, and a big rain come, so I've heard her talk about that.
Did she ever tell you what were the favorite traveling songs? Did she ever mention the names of any of the songs that were favorites among them traveling across?
Well, no, I don't believe so. She may have, but I've forgotten. I don't remember any of them.
Other than the rainstorm, can you think of any other events that she spoke of going across that you feel might be of particular interest?
Well, the men folks, brought their hunting dogs. They liked to hunt, fox hunt, and they brought their hunting dogs, and one morning they woke up and they missed their main dog, the one that they counted on so much, and so they couldn't find him any place, but they came on without him, and when they got here, they got word from Georgia that the dog had come back home. He went all the way back. They were about halfway here, I think, when he took a notion he didn't want to come any farther.
What state was he in? You know,
Well,
Alabama or Mississippi?
well, I imagine it was Mississippi because they, that would be about halfway, I guess.
Well,
I don't know where they were, but
Huh?
it's a long ways from home, though. But he took a notion he'd not come to Oklahoma. So, and when they did get to Oklahoma, Mama said she remembered driving up to this place where her Uncle Tom Walford and Uncle Bob White lived in the little log cabin, and all the girls were all lined up by the side of the wall there, waiting for them. They saw them coming, you know, and they were all lined up there waiting for them, and they all had on dresses just alike. That in those days and time, they would buy a whole bolt of cloth and make all the children a dress.
I see you have some pictures with you.
Well,
Is that what they are?
this is the first schoolhouse after statehood in Hanson. That's the first school I went to, and that was
Right, well, that's the statehood.
yes, as the schoolhouse was built right after statehood, and that's the first teachers we had there.
Uh-huh.
And
You were about 8 years old.
yes,
About
that's
second
right.
grade, maybe.
Well, no, I think I was well, I might have been second. I was born in 1899.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that'd make me 8 years old. That's right. That's about the time that I started. And this is a picture of his father, and that's the only picture we can find of him. The old home place burned down, and we just don't have any pictures now. It might be that his brother has some. I can. I'll try to see if I can
That's
find
Mr.
any.
Garvin.
Yes, that's
Mhm.
Mr. Garvin.
Is this any kin? Is this family akin to the Garvin Garvin Paul Valley Garvin County family? The Garvin County.
Well, not that I know of.
They took us off.
Well, these are Cherokees.
Yes.
Now, that's my father and mother in 1897. That's when they were married. And this is a singing school way back in about 1894, I'd say, or 5, about that time.
Tell about the singing school. Of course, this was before your time, but what was the singing school?
Well, they just had a what I'd call a normal, and they would teach those children to sing. And all these folks here are all about gone now. They're most all dead. And
The singing. Tell about the schools you attended.
well, we started at the schoolhouse on the side of the mountain there, and at first we had 2 teachers, and then in a few years, 2 more were added, and I don't know. It is by the time that well, I don't remember how many years it was before the high school was built and the schools began to consolidate, but it was quite a while.
What were the early social events in this area?
Well, we would have pie suppers and pound socials. Everybody would bring a pound of something, you know, they'd call it pound, maybe do just covered dish, what we'd call a covered dish now. But they would have large crowds, and then they would have what we'd call a play party after the social, and all play party games, and they would have music, you know, and it wasn't dancing, but they just called it play party.
What was the favorite music of that time?
Oh, the fiddle, violin.
Can you think of any other events of your mother's that you think that she might have told you about in the early period?
Well, Not just offhand, I don't
You were
believe.
about 7 years old, or 8. You were about 8 years old, I guess, at the time of the statehood convention. Do you remember anything about the feeling here at the time that statehood began? I mentioned this because they had the Sequoia convention about a year earlier, you know, and there was some talk about 2 states.
Well, I don't remember
You
much.
don't remember any of that?
No, I don't remember much about that.
Where did you finish school?
Well, I went over to Tahlequah.
Did you to Northeastern?
Northeastern.
Let's talk about Northeastern at that time. Now that would have been about about the time of World War I, wouldn't it?
Yes, I guess so. Well, I didn't finish college. I went over there I don't think I went but about 2 summers over there. I taught school though. You know, all you had to do was have a certificate. They had first, second, and third grade certificates, you know, and I had a second grade certificate. And I taught school. I taught school for 3 or 4 years.
What years did you teach school? About?
Well,
About time of World War I?
I married in 1919, and I taught school 4 years prior to that.
So it was during World War I. Why don't you talk a little about the experience of school teaching? Excuse me. Go ahead, Jim.
This was the teacher here, and he was a member of the Constitutional Convention.
Oh, what was his name? Why don't you tell us about him?
Mr. J. No, it's J. Stockton.
Oh, that's J.
Yeah.
Winchester.
No, this is J.
You thought
Stockton.
it was
Winchester Allen.
Did you know Winchester Allen?
Yeah.
Who? Tell us about him. He was on
He
top.
taught here some too. And Hanson, I think.
Well, I wasn't very well acquainted with Mr. Allen. My husband knew him.
We'll ask
He
him
lived
about
not
him.
he lived not far from here,
All right.
and he was a stockman and a school teacher and a preacher and a little of everything. He was a nice guy.
Can you think of any of the prominent people who, among the various prominent people who played a role in the history, whom you have known in this area?
Well, Uncle Dave Faulkner wasn't he the chief of the Cherokee?
Yes, he's a sub-chief of the Cherokee and the judge of the Cherokee.
Tell about him.
Well, he lived not far from us, and I was reared with his children, and we all played together and everything, and he had a large family, and most of the girls went to school at the seminary at Tahlequah. The older girls were older than I was. I grew up with the younger ones. He had 2 groups of children, one by his first wife, and then the second wife, he had a younger group, and I grew up with a younger group. And well, I just don't remember.
Did you know the Wymans, Ms. Wyman and Mr. Wyman, and she lives in Fort Smith now, and her husband was on the Constitutional Convention. Then he was president of the college at Tahlequah Northeastern. Did you know him?
No, I didn't know him.
Did you know him, Jim?
No.
Did you know them?
That's right.
Ms. Wyman lives there now. What was to you the most memorable event that you can think of that's taken place in this area? Can you think of any?
Well, I can think of Hanson when it was larger than Sallisaw, and I remember hearing my mother talk about it so much. They had several stores there, and they would have had. It would have been the county seat, I think, but Mr. Uncle Dave Faulkner, they all called him Uncle Dave, he wouldn't let them have the land for the railroad, the Kansas City Southern, to come through, and so they had to change it, and it came through Sallisaw instead, and Sallisaw was became the county seat then, and Hanson just kind of dwindled away.
How big is Hanson now?
Well,
About. It's pretty small, isn't it?
yes, it's just a small field.
100
It's now.
or so.
Oh, I'd say there's about 250.
200. What did you have when it was at its largest? Do you remember
Well,
about?
I can't remember.
Was it supported by an industry? Did it have an industry, or was it all farming?
It was just farming, as far as I know.
No industry, no gin or no.
Yes, they had cotton gin here. Yes, they did. Mm-hmm.
There's two doctors here at one time.
It did.
Yes, they had.
And they went here to Sallisaw. They were principal doctors of the county.
Well,
You
who were
know,
the doctors?
Dr. Green and Dr. McKeel.
And Dr. Keith was here for a short
Yes,
time.
he was.
Three doctors.
Uh-huh.
And they operate out of here and travel to Sallisaw as a secondary place. Is that right?
Yes, and well, yeah, they later moved to Sallisaw. This was the main place at that time, but Sallisaw began to grow, and then they moved on to Sallisaw. And Mr. Ivy, you know, Walter Ivy's parents, they lived at Hanson at that time. And my mother said that she took, when she went to church, Ms. Ivy introduced her to the young folks, you know, and that's how she got acquainted with everybody. I don't know if he had a drugstore here or not, you know. He might have had, but I know they had a drugstore in Sallisaw for years and years, but I don't know if they had a drugstore here at that time or not.
So it's the location of the railroad that in effect
That's what
caused Hanson to go down south.
that's what everybody thinks.
Which
Everybody
is true,
thought
of course,
that.
with a lot of other places too.
Yes, I guess so. Well, that's
There had a hotel, too, but I don't know where that's true.
You have some notes. Oh,
Across the depot,
but it's gone now.
yes, Hanson's about the depot's gone and everything.
I noticed you have some notes there. Are they something we haven't talked about yet?
Well, these were just some. This is not a plot. I got the wrong notes here, but these were about my mother, what happened to her in Georgia, you know, and before she came here, and this isn't what I was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
But I remembered most everything that was in the notes anyway. So,
Jim, I wonder what you feel there's anything else we ought to explore?
Well, one of her sisters married, was the wife of the man that consolidated the schools here, Kirkendall, Miss Kirkendall.
the first high school.
Yes,
My brother-in-law.
Her sister's husband established the first high school.
Your
here.
sister's husband. Why don't you tell about the establishment of the first high school, how it came about?
Well, the high school, they called it Union Graded 4, UG4, and the two schools, Hanson and Mershon, over here, it was about 2 or 3 miles over there. That took in the territory over that way, and they put the high school in the center here, where both schools could have access to it, you know. And Gene Kirkendall was the first superintendent. He and his wife both taught there, and the school grew. There was, I don't remember how many teachers they had at first. Do you remember?
No, I don't remember.
But
We got up to 14, 15 teachers at one time.
yes, and the
Mr. Garvin, why don't you sit over here on the other side of it?
All
or can we? Would you like to sit here, or we can just hand you that? I would like to visit with you a little while if we could.
Well, I'll get over there and let him sit here.
Okay. All right, I can hand it over there. Be fine. Mr. Garvin is, I believe, a little over 1/3 Cherokee. Isn't that correct?
That's right.
Why don't you tell us where you were born and who your parents were, and a little about your parents to begin with?
My parents was Ben Garvin, and
Your mother?
mother was a Baines, Obie Baines' daughter, and I think she was a football.
And your father, what portion, sir, was he? What was
He was 8, I think it was.
Were you born in Oklahoma, in Indian Territory?
Yeah,
When were you born?
1895.
1895.
And I was
And were you born in this area?
born on the same place, born and raised the same place for 77 years.
Well,
Just a different house.
your father's house was back in behind here now. Is that
Yeah,
right?
just across the wash over.
And it's no longer there.
No,
But this is a part of the family farm.
that's right.
Now, at that time, it was community property. Isn't that correct? You didn't have individual title to property at that time, did you? Was before the Dawes Commission too.
Yeah.
Do you recall? Can you recall some of the things? And you were here in the very early days, and you were a part of the Cherokee Nation yourself. What was your attitude or your family's attitude as Cherokees to the? Of course, you married one of the white people who came over. I say white, some of the non-Indian who came over. But what was the Cherokee attitude generally? Was it one of wanting the people, other people, to come in and settle and farm, or is it one of wanting to be separated? I know that it's difficult to ask a question like this because there are many variations of opinion. But I wonder what was the general attitude at that time?
Well, they wanted to be separated. But some of them did and some of them didn't.
Of course, Georgia, a lot of the Cherokees came from Georgia, and was this one of the reasons why a lot of Georgia people who were non-Indian came into this area because of earlier associations with Cherokee? Was this true or not? Or did it just happen that way?
I don't believe
You don't think so?
They were mostly white people that came, and I don't think they. I'm not sure about that. But
I didn't know either. It just occurred to me. You're being from Georgia. I mean, maybe they. Do you know?
She gave a pretty good answer a while ago when she said that Mr. Baldridge liked the Georgians because they were good workers and good farmers.
Yeah, they like cattle.
They like to rent their land because the return on their rent share was good, you see. So from that standpoint, they were well accepted.
The Cherokees had a lot of arrangements. For instance, the cattle arrangement. Of course, all of these were income producing. You know, in other words, they produced income, whereas the land wouldn't have otherwise.
That's right.
Yes. Yes. Tell about. Go ahead from there. I diverted a little. Why don't you tell about your father's profession, his business?
Tell about
His cattle.
land.
oh, he had right around 1,000 head of cattle, 800 to 1,000 all the time. And he'd sell them in the fall, some of the steers to certain people. And he'd just get $20 a piece, but he made more money then than he does now. It wasn't out nothing. You didn't have to pay nothing for them. There wasn't nothing said about the scale. I guess I had the cotton scale, but I was just a little kid and wouldn't give me wouldn't hardly want to take my check. So you and mine, I can mess everything up. And if I just give them so much for the bunch, and they're proud to get it too. That's the only way they get any money.
Well, to run 1,000 head of cattle in that time, you had to have quite a few people working for you, didn't you? Quite a few cowboys.
Yeah.
How many cowboys did he have?
Oh, I'd have 3 or 4.
Is that, you mean 3 or 4 could handle 1,000 head?
Oh, just let them go everywhere. They just go everywhere.
Tell him about the land on the mountain where he's taken.
He had about 2,000 acres up the fence, and statehood come, he had to take all that down. He didn't want it, and brought his wire back home, and he just let that go up there all of a sudden.
They wanted to lot him up there.
Yeah, they wanted to lot him up there, so you got more fenced up there, and you can lot. And Dad told me he didn't want that up there.
Was this allotment, of this land allotment, this was actually a little ahead of statehood, wasn't it? Wasn't it during the... was this allotment, of this land allotment, this was actually a little ahead of statehood, wasn't it? Wasn't it during the Dawes Commission period? That's this would, I suspect that the cattleman was not particularly pleased about being allotted land because the cattle just couldn't run as much. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, some of them no would go far.
Mm-hmm.
And they just follow anyhow.
Uh-huh.
Going over and see old boards, boards up above Aikens there. I went over to see him about a dozen times, and he'd run off from them.
Yeah. Duff, you told me something very interesting about when your dad sent some cattle to Osage country, and you went with them and helped load the cattle and so on for summer grazing.
Well, how come it? They went to dipping cattle, and they dipped them every 2 weeks, and we was dipping with about 25 dipping vats, and they got to where then the constable and the dip man they'd paint them, and then they'd go around and see why you got them in there, and if they didn't, well, they'd charge you down half a piece for them. So Dad, he didn't like that a bit, and he said he would just rent him a pasture out away from here and leave out. Said the dip man and the constable make more money than he would, and he kept talking about it, and I don't know if it had somebody to put confidence in, he'd send them off. He kept on talking about it, and I told him one day, I said, I'll go if you let him have the 4 horses I want. He had 10 or 15 best horses. He wouldn't fool with that pug horse. He wanted a show enough horse. They buy me a saddle over the fall, brand young. Of course, saddle's cheap then. Cattle was cheap, and saddles was, and everything. But he always wanted a good horse and a good saddle. Said, you can't do nothing with no pug horse and a bale wire saddle. Of course, I agreed on that. I like that deal fine. And
were most of his cowboys, were they mostly Cherokees, or were they palefaces too?
Well, just yes, it didn't make no difference.
Didn't make any difference. I didn't know whether he had quite a few of both.
If he didn't have sense enough to ride a horse, he'd put you shucking corn.
Yeah. So
He'd get some work out of you somewhere, though.
Mm-hmm.
How many cattle did you take to the Osage country when you went up there?
Took a train load and 4 head of horses. Dick Sanders, he's in, well, we had 2,100 head. And then there's an old fellow old Hominy, grass was just up and down the creek. He wanted to pasture, and we let him pasture with us a while. His name was Watson from Benjamin, Texas. And he put some in there.
How much did you pay for the grazing?
50 cents an acre.
50 cents an acre for the summer?
Yeah.
One season.
No, yeah, for the summer, for the whole year.
Yeah.
And it's 20 miles around the thing. And me and a fellow by the name of Jack Stubbs, we lived on Dog's Creek in a tent. And we'd start around and we'd meet over at the back end of it about 12 o'clock, and then we'd come home, and that's all we'd do. I want to rest up. He is the cook, and I was a horse wrangler. Keep him in the trap pasture. It was 80, 100 acres, but I could see all over it. I didn't know where I was going when I got up to get my horses up. And I get the horses up, he'd have breakfast ready, and we'd take off same way all the time. And they carried these old wire pliers and a hammer and a steeple puller and everything all combined.
Where did you sell your cattle?
Kansas City.
How did you get them there?
They take them train, shipped them.
That was by the KCS, Kansas City Southern? Or was it by, how did?
Here
Yes,
on mountain.
on mountain.
Mississippi. Yeah.
But, well, it was Mississippi.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, I'd ship cattle all summer. I'd get me a carload, and the pasture didn't have nothing in it, and I just made money for pastime and gave it to him.
How many did you usually ship up? You had 1,000 head. How many would you ship up every season? That would ordinarily what would be?
Well, in the fall, that's when we'd do the big deal. There'll be all steers from 2s on up, and some of them be 5 or 6 year old. But we just get $20 for them, and we'd take them over there and on stock fields up and down around short, and we wouldn't pay nothing for the stock field, and take them back to the mountain, and it wouldn't be out nothing. And I'd be give $3 or $4 for the steer calf, and he just growed up there. And we'd just go around, and if we didn't get to steer this time, he'd just stay there till next year. And Dad had his brand registered in 3 or 4 counties. Sometimes you just had to pay $1.50 to have it registered, and if they wanted to stray him, well, he'd go in there and find out whose he was, and he'd send him a card, and he'd go over and get him, no matter where it was. He'd go get him. Cost you a penny. You get your postcards and stamp all combined.
Tell them about trying to steal some of these cattle up at Osage.
They'd try to put some of the cattle in the pasture, and a few of them there, well, they'd take some of these out. And one day they took the urine, great big old urine. And I turned this old cow out, and I tracked him way back in there somewhere on Sand Creek, and I found him. And there's an old fellow then come in there, and his name was Lewis. But they claimed that Lewis was one stole. And said, he's as crooked as you be. And I asked him, I said, what makes people the best people I ever seen to help you and do everything and then steal your barn? And he said, if you lose some of them, you go to stealing too. So that's what makes people go to stealing. You lose a few of them while you go to steal.
Talking about taking cattle, selling some to Fort Smith and taking them across the river.
They were sold some down there right in Dallas Country. I guess you knew them, didn't you? One's a great big fat fella, and one's a little hungry cripple fella.
I know the fat one.
His name's Dal, and the old name, I forget now what the other name. He'd come up here and buy 'em, and he'd want all steers, and we'd take 200 or 300, and we'd start with 'em and get down on that grassy lake, and there's hot and water, and just let 'em go in there, and if you'd give 'em time, well, they'd come out then, and you could get 'em when they come out, but if you didn't try to get 'em out right then, you couldn't do it. And then this fellow named Joe Alexander, he was a farmer on this side of the river, and he'd go ahead and put out feed, and he'd get his lot from Joe Alexander, and he had about 75 or 80 head of mules, and he had a good lot, and he knowed it. And he's so well acquainted with this fellow, they'd put the mules somewhere else that night, and they'd have a feed for 'em around the fence, and we'd get 'em in there, and then the next morning, while we'd find out what time we're supposed to go across that bridge, and we'd get 'em all. That toll bridge. It's cost you so much a head. And when it all gets stampeded, people didn't dehorn the cattle, and the old horns go to knocking together, and the old bridge go to rattling, and we'd hold them together, two fellas in front. And as long as we could hold them together, and then when we seen we couldn't hold them no further, well, we'd try to beat them to the end of the way. Get out of the way.
In other words, you'd walk them from Hanson to Fort Smith.
Yeah.
I
And
believe
then
that.
when they get off that bridge, they go towards Coke Hill. There's a lot of niggers used to live over there, and after we got them all bunched and cooled down, well, we wouldn't go up Main Street there in Fort Smith on account of the streetcar. We'd go up Rogers, and we'd go way on over that cemetery, and I'd always know when to get close to the place. There's a brick plant away over there somewhere, and
Well, that's in Arkansas. Now you're gonna get back on Oklahoma.
What's interesting though, this toll bridge. Now, where is it in relation to the free bridge of the Indigo Sound?
it is the railroad and all combined.
Is that where the railroad bridge?
Before the free bridge was built, where they charged toll to go across the railroad bridge, and they'd hold the trains.
Oh, hold the train.
The wagon cost 35 cents. I remember going across there with my dad when I was a kid, and they charged 35 cents. So I don't know what they charged the cows, but a dime when you walk across, you see, from Moffett to Fort Smith.
Let's see, what, during this early period, what would you say was the most exciting thing that happened in this area, say prior to World War I, the most exciting single thing that happened?
When I loaded up that trainload of cattle for the Osage Nation, I guess. That I was about hired to drive a horse. We had a certain time we had to get away from that.
You loaded them on the train here at Hanson.
The old train just backed up at about 1 o'clock, and we was to get away at 4 or 5. And he's cutting these cattle out here at home, and we done had the lots full down there, and we got a place over at Soccer Barge over there where the old boiler laid in the fence, and we put some in there.
About a mile.
Did they have any rodeos among the cowboys in those early days?
No, just old bronc horses that ride over. Oh, yes, I had steer roping, but no calf and stuff like that.
You won the prize one time in Muskogee.
Well, tell about that. Tell about the rodeoing.
I went up from Muskogee and stayed up about 2 or 3 days and led rope, and
You did camp roping?
Yeah. No steers.
Steer
All
roping,
steers
steer
wasn't
roping.
okay. And you'd make a trip with this rope, and you'd jake your old steer down easy if he's running. Just jake your feet out from under him, and the old horse would just keep pulling on him, but you got him tied. You just jump off the old horse quick as you could. Lots of time he'd jump off before he made the trip, because you know you're going to throw him anyway.
Go ahead.
There was one thing that Mrs. Garvin, I thought of it once, but I didn't want to interrupt. The summer Brush Arbor revivals was a high point.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And
Talk about the Brush Arbor revival.
sometimes 100 be baptized at one time.
Yeah.
Yeah, they'd wait till after crops were laid by, and then they'd have the revival. In Brush Arbor, and they'd all come in and bring a pallet of quilts and come in wagons. There wasn't no car. I reckon that first car I've had drove over that short, and they asked me, said, "Where you put the horse to this thing?"
Did you ever attend a Brush Arbor revival, Miss?
Yes,
Why don't you tell about it too? Let's get it in both. You maybe. I'm not quiet. Sit down there. Just explain the Brush Arbor revival and what they were.
Well, they had the Brush Arbor revivals, and the people would come from far and near, all around the community, and everybody came. The old and the young and the little folks, and they'd bring their quilts to make a pallet for the babies to sleep on. And after the sermon was preached, well, they'd all begin to pick up the babies, because they'd know there'd be some shouting and walking around, and they was afraid that they would get stepped on. But the arbors were built with the brush, you know. They'd build a farm for it, and they'd make the brush and put on top so they could have services in the daytime too. And they would have lanterns hanging all around, you know, and to give light. Didn't have very good light, but they didn't know the difference, because that's about the best they had that day and time anyway. And they had good singing, and everybody looked forward to the summer revival, because they knew that it would always happen about the same time each year, and everybody would be through with their crops, and after they'd lay their crops by, why, then was time for the revival, and everybody really enjoyed it.
What were the favorite songs of the revival then?
Well, just the same old songs that they sing in revivals now. I don't remember any of that right offhand. Yes, just the old, same old songs that's been sung for years is just the ones they used to sing back then. What a friend we have in Jesus, and must Jesus bear the cross alone, and songs like that.
The number of people that were converted each summer is amazing too.
Yes, they were. Sometimes they would be 25 or 30 or even more, and they would take them to the creek to be baptized, you know. And they didn't have any baptistry, so then they would get pictures of them, but I don't have any pictures of those baptizings. I wish I did have. But there would be large crowds, and that was something everybody looked forward to each summer.
Jim, do you think anything else about that, Mr. Garvin?
Well, I think he's done a splendid job.
Well, I hope
How about Mr. Garvin?
didn't make a mess of it.
Well,
He didn't tell about driving the cattle across the snow from where was it? You bought you a bunch of cattle down there, and you had to drive them across the river in the
Way
What?
back when I was an old boy, it was just when we had winter time, it was just winter time, and everything froze up, and it stayed froze up. And it come a big snow, and we had some cattle down on that river, and they seen some stalk fields over there, and they just walked across that river. And we were going down there, and all of our cattle done crossed the river. They didn't know when they crossed it. And we went over there and got them. I think they hold up a bunch of cattle, I hold up a man and a horse, and we drove back. Dad, he finally got a thermometer, and he hung it out down the hall. One of the old boys, he wanted to see how hot it was. He stuck a match in on it and make it run up as far as it want to. The East Fargo, I guess you know him. Like to put his eyes out. But it's sure enough winter time. The state winter time.
Cattle didn't know when they crossed the river.
No, they didn't know when they crossed it. It was just snow. There was sure enough snow too, way up there, a foot or better.
This has been an interview with Mr. and Mrs. Garvin in eastern Oklahoma, and Hanson. The date is April the 25th, 1972. I'm kicking back in for just a minute to the interview with Mr. Garvin. You were telling us about the selling of cattle, and also the only kind of white man's money you'd accept. Why don't you tell about the selling of cattle and how you would, you were discussing how you would sell whole lots just by talking and say, well, I'll give you so much for the whole lot. Why don't you come back and just explain that whole thing? Tell it like you were telling it to us a minute ago.
Well, I'd just go and stay a week with people, and he'd have a little old bunch of cattle, and I'd buy him first, and then he'd help me buy these others and drive them in, and I just stay with him, and it didn't want no board money. All you had to do is buy coffee and sugar that time. The rest of the eat, and you just stay as long as you wanted to, and they'd take it an insult if you wanted to pay them for something, board or something now. And they wouldn't want nothing at all.
Now you're talking about selling cattle.
Yeah, I just buy the cattle, and the old fella'd have 12, 15 old milk caves, and he wanted to get rid of them, and I'd look at them and tell him just what I'd give him for the whole bunch. They didn't have no education, they couldn't figure it out, and I'd just give them that much. But when they started to give him a check, why, he said, "Now, Tuffy," he said, "look like to me you ought to have some sure enough money." I said, "I don't like the white man check." Says, "Can't endorse it or nothing, and you have to go to a lot of places, and I just rather have money." And so next time you come back, you bring money. And so you can buy them cheaper than that. So we learned how to have money. And one old Indian way up there close to Lion Switch, he didn't have no education. He wanted gold money. And his name was, let's see, what was his name? I can't think of his name now, but every time he'd turn a steer out, why, you'd give him a $20 gold piece, and those steers is 4 and 5 years old. They'd just been growed up there, and he had them. But he wanted, every time one come out, he'd want that $20.
Well, he might not have had any education, but he wasn't dumb, was he? You should have told him you're better than 1/3 Indian, and maybe he'd have taken your check. You've been more creditable.
I had lots of trouble on account of just a little old kid that said, "Money," said, "You get everything all messed up," and said, "You're money, and your check ain't no good." And it's just whether your dad wants you to cash it or not. I was checking on Dad all the time. I had an account myself, but I'd check on him too. And I just wrapped up in money in a way, and it wasn't. But I was over at Long one time wanting dinner, and I went to that old fellow at Brownfield. He run the bank, and he wouldn't take a $5 check. And I told him what I wanted and this and that. He said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to cash your check, and the next time you come to town, said, I'm going to take this bugger whoop and whoop you all over town, but that ain't no town. I told him it was a good one. I told him just good as Dad's check. I'd signed it B.F. Garvin by B.J. Garvin, and he had it fixed to the banker, you know. And my signature just as good as his, in a way.
Well, again, this has been a wonderful visit with the Garvins.